All right, welcome to this explainer. If you're here, you probably want to understand the true mechanics of the world around you, right? Well, today we're unpacking the hidden forces, the invisible plumbing, and honestly, the fascinating human psychology that drives the single most important asset class on the planet, the real estate market. We're going to break down this complex architecture of real estate finance, layer by layer, so you can see exactly how it all works under the hood.
Okay, let's dive into this massive number, $20 trillion. Think about that for a second. That's the approximate value of real estate owned directly by households in the United States today. To put that into perspective, the value of stocks owned directly by households, that's only about $6 trillion. So household real estate wealth completely dwarfs the direct stock market. For the typical family, their home is literally the absolute bedrock of their accumulated wealth. It's a massive, multi-trillion-dollar system, and it is entirely reliant on a highly specific set of financial rules.
So here is exactly how we're going to navigate this today. First, we'll uncover who actually owns the commercial skyline. Then we'll trace the evolution of mortgages. Third, we'll crack the math behind your loan. Fourth, we'll reveal the government's hidden hand in the market. And finally, we'll look at the sheer psychology of housing bubbles.
All right, let's get into Section 1. Who owns the skyline? Uncovering commercial real estate.
Have you ever driven past a massive 50-story skyscraper downtown and wondered, who actually holds the deed to that thing? Historically, commercial buildings weren't owned by everyday people. They were held in what are called DPPs, or direct participation programs. These are complex partnerships largely designed to bypass corporate profits taxes. But because they carry unique risks, the government restricts them to accredited investors, basically people with over $1 million in net worth. So, wealthy individuals use DPPs to shield their income, while regular folks were totally left out. But in 1960, Congress realized this wasn't entirely fair, so they created the REIT, or Real Estate Investment Trust. And this brilliantly illustrates how the market shifted, completely democratizing commercial real estate and allowing everyday investors to buy shares of a portfolio of properties, much like buying a regular stock.
But Congress didn't just hand out tax advantages without putting up some strict guardrails. To qualify as a REIT, a company can't just be a retailer like Walmart that happens to own its own stores. Nope. 75% of their assets and income must strictly come from real estate. Furthermore, they can't hoard the cash. They're legally required to pass 95% of their income directly back to investors. And most importantly, Congress didn't want to encourage short-term speculation. They explicitly penalized flippers by heavily taxing income from properties held for less than 4 years. They wanted REITs to be stable, long-term custodians of the skyline, not day traders.
Moving right along to Section 2, the evolution of mortgages, from 5-year balloons to 30-year standards. So that covers the commercial side, but what about the homes we actually live in? It's kind of fascinating how drastically the rules of the game have changed over time. If you bought a house in the 1920s, your mortgage was, frankly, terrifying by today's standards. You typically got a 5-year loan paying only interest. Then, at the end of those 5 short years, you owe the entire principal in one massive balloon payment. You were basically just expected to refinance. But when the Great Depression hit in 1929 and unemployment skyrocketed to 25%, millions suddenly couldn't refinance. The banks just said no, and people lost their homes in droves. This catastrophic failure forced the government to step in. In 1933, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, or HOLC, stretched the term to 15 years. By 1934, the FHA pushed it to 20 years. And by the early 1950s, the modern 30-year standard was finally born, safely carrying homebuyers all the way to retirement.
Now, extending the timeline wasn't the only fix. The government also mandated that these new loans be self-amortizing. Basically, this is a loan structure where your regular monthly payment covers both the interest owed and a chunk of the principal balance. This was absolutely revolutionary at the time. It meant that at the end of your 15, 20, or 30 years, you wouldn't owe some massive balloon payment. You'd be totally free and clear, a zero balance. You actually owned your house free and clear.
Okay, let's look at Section 3, the math behind the loan, cracking the annuity formula.
So how does that self-amortizing math actually play out month to month? Look, I want to speak directly to anyone watching this who's ever stared at their mortgage statement in sheer frustration. Why does it feel like you're paying thousands of dollars a month, but your loan balance barely even moves? Well, it's all because of the annuity formula. Your total monthly payment stays strictly constant, sure, but what's happening underneath is a dramatic, hidden shift. In month 1, your balance is huge, so the interest you owe is huge. Almost your entire payment just goes to the bank's interest, barely denting the principal. But fast forward to year 29, now your balance is tiny. The interest owed is virtually nothing. So your exact same monthly payment now acts like a sledgehammer, going almost entirely toward rapidly wiping out the remaining principal.
It feels painfully slow at first, for sure, but the math accelerates right at the very end.
Which brings us to Section 4, Government's Hidden Hand, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac.
We know the math now, but where does all this mortgage money actually come from? Let's move to and see how this builds a continuous engine of real estate funding. It works in 3 steps. Step 1, a local bank, the originator, lends you money to buy your house. But think about it. If that bank just held on to your 30-year mortgage, they'd eventually run out of cash to lend to the next family, right? So, step 2 happens. Government-sponsored enterprises, Fannie Mae, created back in 1938 and later Freddie Mac, step in and buy that mortgage right off the local bank. And this brings us to step 3. The originator suddenly has their capital freed up again, allowing them to turn around and make brand new loans to new buyers. It's honestly a brilliant perpetual motion machine for housing liquidity.
But here is the catch. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are technically private companies. They have traded stocks, yet they borrow money at incredibly low interest rates because global investors look at them and say, this exact quote, "Surely the U.S. government is not going to allow Fannie and Freddie to fail." There is a massively powerful implicit guarantee from the government that makes investors pour endless capital into these entities. It's essentially private profit backed by public psychological reassurance.
And that segues perfectly into our final chapter, Section 5, The Psychology of Bubbles, Irrational Exuberance and FOMO.
You see, money and math alone really don't explain why markets explode. Human emotion does. Consider this wild data from 1988. Researchers surveyed residents in Los Angeles and Milwaukee about their expectations for home prices. In Los Angeles, the median expectation was that home values would skyrocket by 10% every single year for a decade. That means they expected prices to more than double in just 7 years. Extravagant, booming expectations. But over in Milwaukee, folks grounded their expectations at a steady, inflation-matching 4%. It perfectly illustrates how localized market fever can just completely distort reality.
And what drives those inflated expectations? Well, it's a quantifiable contagion, fear of missing out. FOMO isn't just some trendy internet acronym, it's a literal, measurable economic driver. In that exact same 1988 survey, a staggering 80% of Los Angeles residents confessed they were worried that if they didn't buy immediately, they'd be priced out forever. They were panic buying based entirely on an imagined future. Meanwhile, in steady Milwaukee, only 27% felt that same pressure. The fear of being left behind is exactly what pours gasoline on a localized housing boom.
But as time went on, this psychological phenomenon broke out of glamorous, isolated cities like Los Angeles. Researchers actually began documenting a globalization of the housing bubble. The data showed shockingly synchronized housing booms happening simultaneously in places as distant as Boston and London. Sharp, historic price spikes were charted in Norway and the Netherlands. Heck, even Milwaukee's modest expectations eventually crept up to match Los Angeles in the 2000s. We started seeing a synchronized global housing boom driven not by local supply and demand, but by a pervasive global culture of economic optimism and shared psychology.
So the crucial point is this staggering number, 100%. Today, mortgage debt has ballooned to roughly 100% of personal consumption expenditure. To understand how radical that is, you have to go back to the early 1950s when that number was only about 25%. We become vastly more comfortable taking on staggering amounts of real estate risk, continuously pushing the absolute limits of our own financial foundations.
So, we've seen the skyline ownership, the math of the 30-year mortgage, the invisible government engines, and the sweeping globalization of housing euphoria. All of which leaves us with one final, pretty profound question to ponder the next time you look at the housing market. Are we really buying homes for shelter? Or are we fundamentally just buying the fear of being left out? Thank you so much for learning with us today.